think back to the days of the great fathers of modern science, people like Sir Isaac Newton, huge minds, incredible brain power. They saw layers, they saw canyons, but they never once saw the millions of years. Why does every schoolboy look out there and say, I see millions of years today? The facts haven't changed. What's changed is the belief system that you carry in your head that you use to interpret the facts. So let's start with the Bible, with the right bias, if you like, in interpreting the facts. Billions of dead things laid down by water all over the world, showing signs of death, disease and suffering. So from the Bible we know that must be after Adam sinned. Is there anywhere in Scripture that gives us a hint as to how come you've got this sort of evidence? You know what? If you look at it that way, there is not just a verse or two dropping a hint. There's 3 whole chapters telling you about a massive, globe-covering, watery catastrophe, the flood of Noah. You ever wondered if the Bible takes 3 whole chapters on something, it might just be important? You know, I think one of the reasons why we've tended to overlook that awesome account is because of that children's fairy tale image, you know, the leaky bathtub with a couple of giraffes' necks poking out. I said that once in one church and they shuffled very uncomfortably, and I found out why afterwards. It was a big church like this, and I went out to their nursery and a huge picture of leaky tub, giraffes' necks, the whole thing. What's the message we're spelling out to our young people with that sort of image? We're saying this is just a fairy story. You couldn't possibly fit all those animals on a leaky tub like that. You know, we don't really believe it as history. It's like Aesop's fables. In fact, the dimensions of the ark given in the Scripture show that it's an incredibly sized vessel. Plenty of room for Noah and his family, not just to put all the animals they needed on board, but play shuffleboard as well. Look at this picture of the ark. You can see some things for scale. There's a truck there, there's a person and a dinosaur, there's a whole lot of railroad boxcars, incredibly sized vessel. You know, people say, well, how can there be all that water from a few days and nights of drizzle? But the Bible itself doesn't say that the rain was first. Before it started to rain, it says all the fountains of the great deep were broken up. Can you imagine the crust of the earth tearing open all over the world? And it says that those fountains prevailed. They kept pouring until 5 whole months had passed. And only then were they shut, until the whole of the mountains under the whole of the heavens were covered. And, you know, and then it was nearly a year, more than a year, before Noah and his family could step out onto solid ground. And at the end of that catastrophe, we read in Psalm 104, the mountains rose up, the valleys sank down. You know, people say sometimes, well, where'd the water go? I mean, if there was a flood, global flood, where's all the water? Well, I wonder if you can guess. We live on an incredibly soggy planet, don't we? You know, there's plenty of water in the earth. If you reverse that process in Psalm 104 and you push down the mountains and push up those ocean basins, you've got enough water to cover the globe to a depth of 2.7 kilometres. And people say, but, I've been taught that one layer equals one time period. But we know that's not true anymore. We know that one catastrophe can cause lots of different layers. And in fact, the flood would have been a complex set of interconnected catastrophes on a mega scale. Would have made the tsunami look like a damp firecracker. You know, here's a cliff face in Washington State. Over 8 metres of layered sedimentary rock. This is not lava flow. These are ash flows and pyroclastic flows and mud flows. See the person standing there for scale. Now, all of those thousands of layers we know formed in one afternoon, June the 12th, 1980, when Mount St. Helens blew its top. And there was molten snow and there were mud flows and so on. And there were over 600 feet of layered sedimentary rock laid down over months in that region. And in fact, there were canyons carved, some of them through solid crystalline rock. Here's a mini Grand Canyon, 1/40th scale model. And what about the fossils themselves? You know, you can actually use them as a witnessing tool to show that the biblical worldview makes more sense of the evidence than what most people carry in their head. Because you ask the average person how you get a well-preserved fish fossil, and there are billions of well-preserved fish fossils in rocks around the world. This one's exceptionally well-preserved, but usually you'll have the fins and often the scales and the bones in the right place and so on. The average person has a belief system like this. This is an Australian textbook, The Web of Life. And see those 3 panels from left to right. See how the mountains in the background are shrinking down. That's meant to be erosion over millions of years. So the belief is that the fish died millions of years ago and it sank to the bottom, and as the bits of sand and mud washed in from the rivers, lakes and seas, it gradually covered that little fish, and then it gradually hardened and turned into a fossil. Isn't that the general picture people have? Friends, your common sense will tell you you cannot possibly get a well-preserved fish fossil like that. Think about it. First of all, what happens when most fish die? Do they sink to the bottom like the textbook says, or do they... I mean, if you don't believe me, use the experimental method. Teaspoon of cyanide, go home to your goldfish bowl, see what happens. And once you've done that, and you've got poor little Goldie floating on top, and you scoop her off, what will you do? Will you throw her into Cape Town Harbour and wait for thousands of years for a fossil? Of course not. What happens in the real world? The seagulls rip into it, the scraps sink to the bottom. Within 24 hours, when everything else has a feed, you're very lucky if you've got more than a backbone and a couple of ribs poking out. You know, when you're out snorkeling or you're looking at a documentary on the sea floor, you don't see all these thousands of dead fish sort of half buried, three-quarter buried, and so on. It's not the real world. What would you need to do to turn Goldie into some sort of an artificial fossil? I'll tell you what you do. You drop her on the footpath and back up one of those ready-mix cement trucks and you dump a load of concrete on. Now, why concrete? Well, it's not good enough to just bury her quickly in some damp sand or mud. That'll stop her being eaten suddenly by the local cats. But if you don't have the right cementing ingredients so that that stuff doesn't go hard within a few weeks at the most, what are you going to find when you dig through that soft, crumbly stuff a year later? Partway fossil, or stinking mess, or maybe nothing at all. It's obvious, isn't it? Because if it's not hardened, you're not going to get that shape preserved of the scales. You're going to have water, oxygen, bacteria. It's just going to disintegrate. You know, this is not rocket science, is it? It's just common sense. But you can actually use something as straightforward as a fossil fish to indicate to people, not to prove the Bible, but to show them that this speaks of rapid processes, rapid burial, rapid hardening, which is what you'd expect if you start by faith in the Bible. Faith is not a blind leap in the dark. Never has been in the Bible. But it's a reasonable step, not a blind faith. Sometimes the evidence for rapid burial is even more spectacular. Here's a fish buried so quickly it never had time to finish its lunch. See that? You know, a lot of the pictures that you're going to see come from our Creation magazine. It now goes to 140 countries around the world, as you heard. Of course, some of those countries only one person gets it, but it sounds good anyway. No, kidding. I'll talk more about that at the end when the pastor calls me back up, but that's our tool for reaching people through you. We don't take any paid advertising, so we want every page to be a witnessing. I've heard of difficult labour, but I don't believe that labour took thousands of years while being slowly covered up. Literally speaks of rapid processes. By the way, some years ago I was doing my first lecture tour of Ontario in Canada, and it was a Sunday morning service, and the pastor said to me, Dr. Wheeland, we'd like you to put something in your talk that's relevant to Mother's Day. And I said, okay. I had a few problems when Father's Day came around. I had nothing to think of. You know, a lot of this age of the earth stuff is more psychological than logical. You know, we think of all these processes that are supposed to take millions of years, but actually, if you stop and think, in every case, like petrification or fossilization, if you've got the right conditions, it doesn't take long time periods. I mean, here you have this huge lump of solid rock. I mean, it must have taken, you know, hundreds of thousands of years and so on. In fact, that's the Tippy Fountain in Wyoming, and that started forming in 1903. They just shoved a pipe, it's a lot of hot springs, mineral-laden hot springs, shoved a pipe up and dribbled it over some rocks, and it formed. And they did the same thing a few years later, and there's another one a few blocks across the road. Here's a hat that evolved from a soft hat to a hard hat very, very quickly. It's on display in a museum in Tarawera, New Zealand, as a result of a volcanic eruption. Here's an opal that was formed in just weeks from someone in Australia mixing up some chemicals in a jar, simple ones like you find in the ground. No heat, no pressure, no millions of years.